The train screeched to a halt under the dim American sun, a sun that felt warmer, somehow gentler, than the one they had left behind in Europe. Dust rose around the steel wheels, and the doors clanged open. Out they stepped, German women in threadbare uniforms that once carried the proud insignia of a Reich now collapsing in ruins. Their boots were cracked, their hair tied hastily back, their eyes hollowed by fear and hunger. They had braced themselves for barbed wire, for snarling guards, for humiliation meted out as vengeance. Instead, they found something wholly disarming: rows of whitewashed fences, neat barracks with straight lines, and the smell, yes, the unmistakable smell, of coffee drifting across the yard. For many of them, it was the first whiff of true coffee in years. They stood frozen, their bodies taut with dread, but their senses betrayed them, whispering that this was not the hell they had rehearsed in their minds. The guards who approached were not the caricatures of cruelty they had imagined from propaganda leaflets. These were young men, their uniforms pressed and gleaming in the sun, rifles slung loosely as though war were already behind them. Their faces were broad, their smiles quick, their accents strange but not hostile. Some were tall enough to look like giants to women who had grown up among gaunt men fed on ration bread and cabbage. One soldier tilted his cap, gesturing with a hand that carried neither menace nor mockery. The women blinked, disoriented, their fear colliding with confusion. The march into the camp was not a march at all, it was a stroll through order. Gravel crunched underfoot, the fences were painted, the grass trimmed. There were no snarling dogs, no whips, no glares of hatred. Instead, there were wooden signs pointing to mess halls and laundries. It felt absurd, almost theatrical, like being led not into prison but into a summer retreat. Yet the barbed wire did glint, sharp as teeth, a reminder that this paradise was still captivity. They were free of hunger and violence, but they were not free. Inside the barracks, the first shock awaited them. Beds. Real beds, lined with clean sheets that smelled faintly of soap. For women who had slept on straw or bare planks through endless nights of bomb raids, the sight was nearly unbearable. One nurse, her hand still trembling from the journey, pressed her face into the fabric and inhaled as though it were a bouquet of roses. Another laughed, an odd, hysterical laugh, as if the absurdity of such luxury inside captivity was too much to endure. Hunger and fear had prepared them for chains, not linens. Food was served not long after their arrival, and here the contrast became almost cruel. Plates clattered with portions of meat, potatoes, vegetables, the kind of meal that had vanished from German tables long before their capture. The women stared, some too stunned to lift a fork, others devouring as though they feared the feast might vanish like a mirage. A few could not eat at first. Their stomachs, shrunken by years of scarcity, rebelled against the sudden wealth of nourishment. Still, the camp cooks, themselves veterans of plenty, offered seconds with cheerful indifference, as if abundance were the most ordinary state of the world. For the first time, the women began to murmur among themselves, trading disbelief like secret currency. Was this a trick? A performance staged for their arrival? Or could it be that America, the faceless enemy they had been taught to despise, truly lived in such endless comfort? The thought unsettled them more than the prospect of punishment. One of them whispered, almost to herself, "If this is prison, then what is freedom here?" Her words hung in the air, fragile yet weighty, a riddle none of them could solve. Yet beneath the astonishment lay unease. They noticed the watchtowers, the guards who remained always present at the edges, the invisible rules that hovered over every plate and pillow. The kindness did not erase the reality of captivity. It sweetened it, perhaps even softened it, but it was still a cage, however gilded. Their movements would be counted, their words measured, their futures uncertain. Some lay awake that first night, eyes tracing the wooden beams above, torn between gratitude and shame. Gratitude for being treated as humans, shame for finding comfort in the land of their conquerors. The soldiers, too, were an unsettling presence. Clean-faced, confident, often laughing among themselves, they were living proof of what the women already feared, that America had won not only the war but the deeper contest of vitality. Compared to these men, their own brothers and husbands, thin, broken, weary, seemed like shadows. The women found themselves stealing glances when they thought no one noticed, caught between resentment and reluctant admiration. It was not just that the soldiers looked strong. It was that they carried an air of unshaken certainty, as though their world had never trembled, as though victory was woven into the very fabric of their being. Letters were promised, though censored. Work was offered, though supervised. There were libraries, music, even the possibility of classes. Each revelation tilted their understanding further. The war had told them America was decadent, brutal, soulless. Yet here was evidence of order, generosity, even a strange kind of respect. It was a paradise built within fences, and every day inside it deepened their confusion. The conflict was no longer simple survival. It became something quieter, more insidious. How to reconcile what they had believed with what they now lived. Some hardened their hearts, insisting it was a mask that would soon drop. Others softened, allowing curiosity to creep in, comparing their treatment here to the bombed ruins of home. Each night, as lamps dimmed across the camp, they turned over in their minds the same question unspoken aloud. Were they prisoners in paradise, or was paradise itself the prison? Weeks passed, and the initial shock faded into routine. Yet the sense of unreality remained. Coffee in the morning, laughter from the guards, the sound of baseball games in the distance. These things gnawed at them like a secret they could neither embrace nor reject. They had been prepared to endure suffering. They had not been prepared to confront kindness, nor to glimpse a world where even captivity felt like a reprieve. And so, as spring winds swept across the fences, carrying the scent of magnolia trees from beyond the camp, the women began to realize their greatest fear was not the captivity itself. It was the unsettling truth blooming in their hearts, that perhaps they did not want to leave. They first noticed it in the way the soldiers stood. Shoulders back, boots gleaming, uniforms pressed so sharp they caught the sun in lines as straight as the fences. To the German women who had grown used to hollow-eyed men stumbling back from the front, these Americans seemed carved from a different world. They were broad-shouldered, well-fed, skin touched by the warmth of a land unscarred by bombs. Even their laughter was unsettling, easy, unguarded, full-bodied. It was the sound of men who had never feared the collapse of their cities, men who carried victory in their posture as casually as a cigarette tucked behind the ear. The contrast was almost cruel. The women thought of the German soldiers they had once followed, their brothers, husbands, sweethearts, now broken, skeletal, their uniforms patched and stiff with mud. They remembered the gaunt faces, the sunken eyes, the bitter taste of scarcity in every embrace. And now, before them, stood these Americans, radiating health as if war itself had been nothing more than an inconvenience. The women whispered among themselves that the uniforms were almost too perfect, the teeth too white, the haircuts too neat. One nurse, her voice low and tremulous, murmured, "They look like princes from another age." For the women, it was not just the appearance but what it implied. To look at an American soldier was to be reminded of a nation untouched by famine, where bread was soft, butter yellow, and meat plentiful. Their pressed uniforms seemed to carry the weight of entire farms, factories, and towns humming safely behind them. Each soldier was not merely a man but a symbol, living proof that their enemy's homeland was a fortress of abundance. It was this abundance, more than the rifles slung casually at their sides, that unnerved the women most. When the guards walked the camp, the women could not help but steal glances. A young private tossing a baseball with his friend looked like a boy at a summer picnic, yet his arms rippled with strength born of years of nourishment. Another, leaning against a post, polished his boots with idle patience, humming a tune that carried across the yard. These were ordinary moments, but to women raised in scarcity, they glittered with an almost cinematic unreality. Even the simplest gestures, an offered cigarette, a nod of greeting, were performed with a confidence that seemed to mock Europe's crumbling dignity. There was a cruel irony in their admiration. These men were their captors, and yet the women could not suppress the flicker of envy, even awe. It was easier to despise a brute, easier to resist a snarling guard who mirrored the cruelty of war. But how does one resist a man who looks like freedom itself? Their uniforms became a kind of torment, reminders that the world outside the barbed wire might never again resemble the life they had known. Statistics whispered the same truth. The average American soldier consumed nearly 4,000 calories a day, while German rations at home had dwindled to less than half that. The difference was visible in every jawline, every stride across the yard. The women measured it instinctively, the way an American's hand dwarfed a mess cup, the curve of muscle beneath fabric, the calm steadiness in their eyes. These were men who had never needed to wonder if they would eat tomorrow. And for women who had survived on turnips and bread crusts, that certainty was as alluring as it was painful. One evening, as the camp settled into its routine, a group of soldiers played music from a crackling radio. Swing rhythms drifted through the barracks, foreign yet intoxicating. Some of the women lingered near windows, pretending to tidy their cots while their ears strained toward the melodies. The soldiers tapped their boots, clapped, even tried dancing in the yard with exaggerated comic steps. For a moment, the camp was filled not with the air of war but with the carefree pulse of American youth. The women laughed quietly to themselves, startled by the sound of their own laughter, as though it had been smuggled past their defenses. Yet admiration bred an uncomfortable conflict. If these men were so full of life, what did that say about the world they came from? Each day their presence chipped away at the women's certainties, eroding the stories they had been told of American decadence and weakness. The evidence marched past them daily. Men whose uniforms never sagged, whose faces never carried the hollow hunger of the Reich. To admit the truth of what they saw was to admit that their homeland had been fighting a war it could never win. Some women hardened themselves, turning away when soldiers approached, refusing to look into those unervingly bright eyes. Others surrendered to their curiosity, whispering questions to one another about the land across the ocean. Did all men there look this way? Was every town filled with boys who smiled as easily as these? They were ashamed of their thoughts, yet could not quiet them. In the privacy of night, lying beneath clean sheets, they replayed the images of broad shoulders, easy laughter, and sunlight glinting off polished brass. The soldiers, for their part, seemed unaware of the effect they carried. Their lives were bound by duty and routine, standing watch, escorting work details, keeping order. Yet even in the monotony, their vitality blazed in every gesture. To the women, it was unbearable proof of what power looked like when it was rooted not in cruelty but in confidence. These men were conquerors without needing to announce it. They embodied not only victory but the promise of a life untouched by ruin. Days turned into weeks, and the camp settled into its rhythm. But the women remained unsettled, trapped not only by fences but by the gnawing awareness that their world was shrinking while another expanded before their eyes. The soldiers walked among them like reminders of everything lost, everything unattainable. To despise them was futile. To admire them was dangerous. To desire what they represented was a torment deeper than hunger. And so, when night fell and the camp grew quiet, the women wrestled with an unease greater than captivity itself. They had come to America expecting to suffer, and instead they found themselves haunted by uniforms that looked like armor of paradise. They had prepared for cruelty but not for beauty, not for the piercing humiliation of realizing that the enemy was not just stronger in arms but brighter in spirit. It was this revelation that kept them awake, because if their captors looked like princes, then perhaps their own homeland had already begun to look like a ruin. And what they would soon be asked to swallow was far more difficult than prison food, the taste of envy, and the fear that they might never want to let it go. The first time the women sat down in the mess hall, they felt as though they had wandered onto the set of some elaborate trick. The long wooden tables were lined with trays already steaming, the air heavy with scents they had nearly forgotten: roast meat, potatoes, gravy thick enough to cling to the spoon. The soldiers serving them moved briskly, their hands steady, their expressions unconcerned, as if such plenty were the most ordinary thing in the world. For the German women, who had survived on watery soups and coarse bread for years, the sight alone was dizzying. They hesitated, staring at their plates as though the food might vanish at the touch of a fork. Then hunger broke through hesitation. The first mouthful was almost painful, their bodies struggling to remember what real nourishment felt like. Meat, seasoned and tender. Vegetables, green and crisp, not wilted scraps. Bread still warm, soft against their teeth. Some wept silently, tears running down dirt-streaked faces, their shame mingled with gratitude. Others devoured every bite with a frantic speed, as though someone might suddenly snatch it away. A few could not manage more than a taste before their shrunken stomachs rebelled, leaving them clutching their sides in discomfort. But even then, they stared at the abundance, unable to believe that tomorrow would bring the same again. It was not only the quantity but the variety that overwhelmed them. Butter, golden and smooth, melted into mashed potatoes. Jars of jam appeared at breakfast, vivid red and purple glistening like jewels. Coffee, strong and aromatic, filled tin mugs each morning, its heat radiating through chilled hands. On Sundays, there were even treats, cakes, ice cream, fruit sealed in jars that tasted of summer. The contrast to Germany was so stark it bordered on cruelty. Back home, their families survived on turnips, powdered substitutes, bitter acorn, coffee. In some cities, people boiled grass for soup. The women chewed silently, and in their minds they saw the hollow faces of children across the Atlantic who would never taste such feasts. The Americans, oblivious to the depth of this inner turmoil, treated meals with casual indifference. Soldiers would joke in the kitchens, tossing extra rolls onto trays, or argue good-naturedly about who had cooked the best stew. Their abundance was not worn with pride, but with the comfort of those who had never known hunger. And perhaps that indifference was what made it sting the most. For the women, every bite was a reminder of absence. For the men, it was just dinner. Soon the mess hall became both sanctuary and torment. The sanctuary lay in the flavors, the warmth of full stomachs, the sweet ache of being nourished again. The torment was in what those meals represented, a gulf between nations measured in calories and taste. Each tray of food whispered of America's wealth, its untouched fields, its factories producing without pause. It was one thing to see the soldiers' strong bodies. It was another to taste the bread that had built them. The women could not escape the symbolism. Here, in captivity, they were eating better than their own families in freedom. A nurse among them, her fingers still stained from tending wounds in field hospitals, wrote in her diary that first week, "We feared chains, and instead we are served meat. I feel guilt with every bite, as though I am betraying those at home by surviving too well." Others confessed similar thoughts in whispers at night, voices low beneath the blankets. They spoke of children scraping scraps from pans in ruined kitchens, of mothers bartering wedding rings for potatoes, of fathers wasting away in silence. Each meal brought a mixture of relief and sorrow, a fullness that felt almost indecent. Yet hunger is stronger than shame. Over time, the women began to savor the meals more openly, to let themselves laugh when a soldier dropped a tray, to sneak an extra roll into a pocket. Food softened not only their bodies but their defenses. It became a language, a daily ritual of abundance that slowly rewrote their understanding of captivity. They realized with a shiver that they were beginning to look forward to dinner bells. They had come prepared to endure misery. They had not come prepared to enjoy themselves. The most startling moment came one evening when ice cream was served. Smooth, cold, sweet in a way that seemed otherworldly, it silenced the entire hall. Spoons clinked timidly against metal bowls, eyes widened in disbelief. For many, it was the first time in their lives. One woman whispered, almost reverently, "Not even our generals had this." Laughter rippled down the table, laughter that was equal parts joy and despair. Ice cream, of all things, had revealed the cruelest truth. America's everyday indulgence was Germany's unreachable luxury. Humor slipped in at odd places. A guard once remarked, half joking, "Careful, you'll be fatter than us before the war's over." The women smiled thinly, though inside the irony cut deep. How strange, to be prisoners warned of eating too much while their homeland starved. It was as though the world had inverted itself, and they were trapped in the upside-down reflection. Over weeks, their bodies began to change. Hollow cheeks filled, eyes lost some of their sunken shadows, strength returned to limbs that had grown brittle with scarcity. But with each sign of health came a hidden dread. If they were becoming stronger here, what would happen when they returned to ruins? How could they step back into a land of famine after tasting paradise, even if it was served behind fences? The food had become more than sustenance. It was a dangerous kind of education. It taught them what was possible, what life could be, and it left them restless, unsatisfied with the prospect of going back. By the time spring ripened into summer, the meals had woven themselves into the rhythm of camp life. The women no longer approached the mess hall with suspicion, but with an almost guilty eagerness. They still thought of home, still mourned the hunger of their kin, but they could not deny their own survival had taken on a flavor of comfort. The feast had become the camp's most powerful symbol, a daily reminder that captivity could taste better than freedom. And so, when rumors began to spread that repatriation would soon come, that one day they would be shipped back across the ocean, the women felt not relief but a tightening in their chests. For they knew that leaving meant returning to scarcity, and that nothing in Germany could ever compare to the strange, shameful paradise they had found here. The plates, the trays, the smells of butter and coffee, they had become a part of them. And the thought of losing it all was more terrifying than the barbed wire itself. The announcement came without ceremony, carried in the low voice of an officer who read from a clipboard on a warm afternoon. The war was over, the camps would soon be emptied, and the prisoners would be returned to Germany. The women stood listening, their faces unmoving, though beneath the surface a ripple of unease spread like a stone striking water. Return. The word should have been salvation, yet it carried the sound of exile. For months they had dreamt of their families, of home soil, of the end of fences. And yet now, staring at the faces of the soldiers who had guarded them with easy laughter, and smelling once more the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchens, they realized they were not ready to go. Germany had become a memory of hunger, ruin, and silence. Letters, when they came, spoke of bombed streets, of cities that no longer resembled cities, of mothers queuing for hours only to return with a crust of bread. Brothers wrote of disease and rubble, fathers of despair. One letter described a grandmother tearing wallpaper from her walls to boil the paste for food. These fragments painted a picture far darker than the barbed wire around them. And so the paradox deepened. The land of their captors had given them more life than the land of their birth could now offer. In the evenings, they whispered in bunks lit by slivers of moonlight. Some confessed dread, others shame, and a few admitted openly that they would rather remain in America, prisoner or not, than face the ashes of their homeland. They spoke of the beds with clean sheets, the steady rhythm of meals, the kindness of doctors who treated their fevers without asking for anything in return. One woman, clutching a small Bible, murmured that she feared freedom more than captivity, for freedom meant returning to a life where survival was uncertain. The soldiers seemed puzzled by their reluctance. To them, captivity was something to be endured, not embraced. They laughed at the idea that anyone might prefer prison, yet they failed to see that these camps were not prisons but islands, green, orderly, abundant, set in a sea of devastation. The women had lived long enough within these islands to taste their sweetness, and now the thought of leaving was like being asked to step back into fire after standing in shade. There was also the matter of the men themselves. The women had watched them for months, admired their strength, their vitality, their careless confidence. Some had exchanged shy words through fences, others smiles or gestures of courtesy. A few dared to dream of lives that might one day cross again, in peace rather than war. Leaving meant severing that possibility, tearing themselves away from figures who had come to symbolize not only power but also a strange kind of hope. These men were proof that the world could be different, that life could be filled with laughter unscarred by fear. To lose sight of them was to step once more into darkness. When the first groups were loaded onto trucks, the camp felt as though its air had thickened. The women left behind watched in silence, their eyes wide, as the engines rumbled and the dust swallowed those who were departing. Some clutched the edges of their coats, others fought tears. They knew their turn would come soon. The image of those trucks became a kind of haunting, steel chariots carrying them not to freedom, but away from the strange paradise they had discovered. In the final weeks, resistance began to show itself in quiet ways. Some volunteered for extra work, hoping that labor might delay their departure. Others feigned illness to remain in the infirmary, where doctors might hold them a little longer. A few wrote letters begging American authorities to allow them to stay, offering their skills as nurses, cooks, or seamstresses. Their pleas rarely received replies, but the act itself revealed the depth of their desperation. They were prisoners fighting not for escape, but for continued confinement. As the last days of the camp approached, the women grew restless. The meals, once a source of joy, now carried a bitterness, as though each bite of buttered bread or each sip of hot coffee was a reminder of what they were about to lose. Laughter from the guards cut more sharply than before. Even the swing music on the radio, once a balm, now felt like a cruel taunt of a world they could not remain in. Every detail of camp life became a keepsake pressed against the heart, for they knew it was about to end. On the morning of departure, when their names were called and bags slung over shoulders, many wept openly. Some pressed their hands against the wooden walls of the barracks as though to memorize the grain of the planks. Others bent to scoop small handfuls of earth, tucking it into pockets like relics. The soldiers who escorted them offered half-smiles, puzzled by the tears, unable to understand why anyone would mourn the end of captivity. But for the women, The barbed wire had become less cage than shield, protecting them from a world far more terrifying than confinement. As the gates opened and the trucks rumbled forward, the women looked back at the camp one last time. The fences, the towers, the barracks, they had been symbols of captivity once. Now they shimmered with the strange light of memory, as though they were leaving behind not a prison, but the last remnant of safety. Ahead lay ruins, hunger, and shadows. Behind them, absurdly, lay paradise. And in that final glance backward, a truth pressed upon them with unbearable clarity. Sometimes freedom is nothing more than another kind of loss. And the greatest cruelty of all was not that they had been imprisoned, but that they had been shown what life could taste like, and then were forced to let it go. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.